Thank you for coming today. We're really happy to be back over in Pike to have the second of 5 talks from people from CDHD. If you don't have already a handout of our next set of talks coming up, there's one by the door that you can pick up on your way out. And so today we're really thrilled to have one of the new faculty members in second language acquisition and elementary education, Blanca Caldas, presenting. She is an assistant professor, and she has a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. And her research interests include bilingual education and bilingual teacher education, minoritized language practices and pedagogies, critical pedagogy, critical ethnography, and participatory action research. So I would write down everything that was on her profile page.
I just blabbed there, so yeah.
But today she's going to be talking about translanguaging, and the title of her talk is Beyond Poly, Multi, Trans, Pluri, Bi. What do we talk about when we talk about translanguaging? So please welcome Blanca Caldas.
Thank you very much for coming in a beautiful day and to be enclosed in a classroom. So beautiful. I can't believe it's this warm. Here we are, and I'm going to talk about translanguaging. And I guess by now in 2007, everybody has heard about translanguaging, right? How many? How many? There you are. There you are. No? You haven't heard about translanguaging yet? Welcome to the club. But what is it? Where does it come from? What do we talk about when we talk about translanguaging? Well, it's a different way to see this phenomenon. I guess if you have heard translanguaging, you definitely, maybe, are familiar with these words. Spanish, Pocho, Tex-Mex, Chicano language. Have you heard these words? These are the language that has been used at the frontera. Mexico and the United States. And this mix of languages and language practices have been there forever. And here are some examples of that: Spanglish, Pocho, whatever you want to call it. Mamá, púchame el columpio. Who can translate that for me, for the people who cannot speak Spanish? How can you translate this? Yes, push me. Púchame. That's that comes from the word push the swing. ¿Por qué no me llamas pa' atrás? I don't know if you heard that word, pa' atrás. Who can translate this for me? Why don't you call me back? Like, pa' atrás means back in English. So instead of saying, ¿por qué no me llamas otra vez? Why don't you call me back? They say pa' atrás. And it's kind of very difficult to translate it because it's so context-based. If you don't understand English and Spanish, you won't be able to get it. Creo que she's not going to la fiesta. Who can translate that? Who can translate that for me? What? I don't think she's going to the party. Normally, when we have these examples of Spanglish or Ingleñol, here there's a new version, the Spanglish in Latin American countries, Ingleñol, Pocho, Tex-Mex, Chicano. Normally, when we see these examples of languaging, we normally analyze them through the focus of code switching. Code switching has been around for ages. For example, here I give you some examples that Soltero, Gonzalez, Escamilla, and Hopewell use an analysis of bilingual writing. And these are some ways to analyze how code switching is produced. For example, intersentential code switching, no puedo hablar in just one language. So you see in the same sentence, one switch from one language to another. Intersentential, and I forgot the L, code switching, two sentences, one in one language and the other in the other one. Aprendí a hacer la división, it's easy. Bidirectional syntax transfer, the dog of my cousin, using the structure of Spanish structure in order to make sense in English. It should be my cousin's dog, but you use Spanish structure. Bidirectional phonetics transfer, punctuation transfer, combo spelling, literal translation, and etc., etc., etc. So we have seen this phenomenon of Pocho, Spanglish, Chicano language in this way to analyze it. So, then comes translanguaging, and kind of changes the way that we see language and how we languages. Translanguaging was coined by Baker in 1996, not very long ago. And Garcia popularized it in 2009. That's why more and more, you see more and more research on this phenomenon. But what is it? Facilitates a connection between home language ecology, so based on language ecology, and integration and identification with the school culture. Translanguaging's starting point is the multilingual individual, not the language, and language itself, and their language practices and an examination of their self and co-construction within their linguistic and cultural community. Translanguaging, and this is important, rejects language as a discrete system, what we call languages, like nation languages, Spanish, English, French, Chinese. They move away from that. And it moves away from conventional parameters we call languages. That's exactly what I said. Multilingualism from a translanguaging stance can be contained within compartmentalizing language policies. So if we use a translanguaging, according to what we just read and what I told you, we cannot divide this, this is in Spanish and this is in English, but one language, according to the translanguaging approach. However, translanguaging, what we call translanguaging, has been studied for a long time, since the 90s, with similar and sometimes competing definitions. For example, the new concurrent approach by Jacobson and Faltis. And they say that this, like putting the two languages together, bring together the child's two languages in a way that would further the child's language development and at the same time lead to satisfactory school performance. So, which means that the new concurrent approach was used as an approach in the classroom. Then Liu came up with translingual practices, and she says that this translingual practice, exactly the same phenomenon we saw at the beginning, the Pocho Spanglish. She says, new linguistic creations, words, meanings, and discourses as means for legitimization. Hybrid linguistic practices in 1999 by Gutierrez, Baquedano, Lopez, and Tejeda. And they say that these hybrid linguistic practices are systematic, strategic, affiliative, and sense-making process among those who share the code in order to achieve mutual understanding. 2010, metrolingualism by Otsuji and Pennycock. And they say that they are linguistic practices, no languages. Again, following the same line as Ofelia Garcia, no discrete languages, to negotiate meaning for self-identity process. Then we continue looking at this. We hear other ways to conceptualize the use of all your language repertoire. That is continuum of biliteracy, transidiomatic practices, code meshing, polylingual languaging, language sharing, dynamic bilingualism, multilanguaging, transglossia, and recently by Max Swan, multilingual perspective, and an article just came out probably a week ago. And all of these deal with exactly the same concept of translanguaging. Connection, using the individual as a starting point in order to discuss languages away from discrete languages. My question is, and I would like to discuss it with you, why are we using translanguaging as the approach that we're seeing now? Lots of research is based on. Why not metrolingualism or code meshing? Why not any other terms that I showed you? Why not? And I would like you to discuss it, because that's something that really, to me, is very. It makes me wonder why it took on that fast. Actually, that was the use of translanguaging was part of a very heated conversation. The bilingual education SIG at ARA conference were having was a very heated conversation with people saying, why are we using this? We already have seen this phenomenon. And the people who were having this conversation were people I already showed you. Some of the people there, the ones that I showed you with the other terms, were part of this conversation. So why translanguaging? Why this term? I want you to, for the people who have read about translanguaging, I would like you to take like a couple of minutes to discuss it. Hey, go. Yes, go. The person next to you, go. You don't have anybody. Why? Come here. There. Why?
This breakdown of not focusing on languages anymore, but focusing on diversity and hybrid.
He's kind of finding middle ground.
Oh my God. Okay, ideas. Ideas. Come back to me. Any idea? I'm using this as a poll too because I want to know why translanguaging. Why are we using translanguaging? Ideas. Go ahead.
I mean, I think there's been a shift in not only who thinking, like recognizing who language acquisition research and language acquisition work has been for, but also who's determining it. So who's looking at it, who's understanding is directing it. And so with the shift in academia of who's in academia over the last 25 years, it's opened up a different way of thinking about languaging and language use that centers the multilingual individual in a translingual societal language use.
Any other ideas? There are no right or wrong answers. At least me, I'm struggling with this because they are exactly the same characteristics from these terms. They're exactly the same. But there are some variations, especially with the, for example, where are you? I don't know how to pronounce this, you know? Thank you. She says that if we use linguistic or multilingual, lingual seems to be like a finality, like a finished process, like a product. That's why she uses languaging to make it a process. And she rejects linguist, or what is that? Languaging. Poly rejects multi. Lots of people reject hybrid because that's not the right word to say, according to some others. And all of them deal with exactly the same thing that you're talking about. Starting
Sort of like different theories of language. So they may be referring to similar phenomena of what we see, but because the theories of language that are their roots are different, they are categorizing what we're seeing and what we're experiencing in different ways to reference those different.
And that could be. Any other idea before I move on to my next? Because I want to engage in this conversation with you. Any idea? Go ahead.
We sort of have like an academic and a cynical. Our academic idea was it was some of the code switching, but actually a lot of it not. Some of the code switching didn't always frame code switching as a positive. You know, it had a deficit orientation. Although actually I would argue the other side of that, but Ophelia would say that this is a more positive, more politically engaged, more holistic perspective on code switching, on multilingual practices. But I have to say that I feel like if we undo a lot of the code switching research was done in order to argue for the systematicity of code switching and to argue against semilingualism.
Absolutely. So
I don't think we want to undo all of that.
Exactly. And I agree with you with the fact that it's more politically oriented. Actually, Ofelia Garcia takes some of the colonial scholars in order to build her approach on translanguaging. She uses a very, very well-known scholar in Latin America called Walter Mignolo to talk about the coloniality in languages. So when we talk about translanguaging, probably it's because we are more aware of the rational linguistic issues. And we can see here in the story of bilingual education that it is a fight to fight, an important fight. The linguistic rights of people who have been stigmatized, especially because of the color of their skin and also the way they speak. Even the people who speak this Pocho, Spanglish, Chicano language, Chicano Spanish, they feel stigmatized, and that produces self-hate. I'm not going to go through this, but you can see that the history of bilingual education and language education has been racist and also linguicist. So why translanguaging? Yes, it's a change of paradigm. However, I have these questions about translanguaging. As you said, there are some things to take into and also to consider. If we take this approach of translanguaging as is, we have to think about different issues. For example, naming rights. And I agree with you. The right to name your language practices have to be on the shoulders of the community of speakers. So, because I've done research on translanguaging, students don't use that word. My students, for example, and I'm going to show you a little bit what I did with this research, use academic code switching. But they meant this. But imposing that language is a form of colonization. Imposing the word translanguaging into the speakers is a form of colonization. What about default and markedness? If Spanish and English are not, then they don't take any part in translanguaging approach. How are we going to analyze? What about all the other areas and fields that analyze language? Linguistics, for example. How translanguage and the translanguaging approach can bring some way to analyze language. Uniformity. Since we see translanguaging from the point of view of the individual, and we see that language practices are different even within a same community of speakers, how are we going to talk about uniformity? There is no, as Ansaldúa says, there is no Chicano language, just as there is no Chicano experiences. Legitimization. If it's not legitimized in the classroom or in the communities, so there needs to be a completely change in the minds of people who are in touch are in contact with students, especially students because we're in education, in contact with students who practice these language practices. Teachers, parents, schools, universities. What about the standalone benefits? So learning or to be able to use translanguaging or all the linguistic practices, not as a tool to learn another language, but learning and using that language by itself. And also it's a contestation to a double language colonialism. And I'm going to show you a little bit of my research very quickly before you start asking questions. I allowed a space in which students would use linguistic practices or what is called translanguaging in the classroom among 22 students, future bilingual teachers who could speak Spanish, and they were very ashamed of using that languages. And my research question was, in what ways do reservist bilingual teachers' discourses and languages practices shift as they participated in the performance of local counter stories of the experience of seasoned bilingual teachers? But I'm going to go through the part of performances, but it was a space in which they could use the language that they wanted. For example, they were also exposed to translanguaging practices. If you see here, you can see what we could call Spanglish, Pocho, or whatever you want to call it. And this was I used this text to talk about the hidden histories in the schools. And this text was created by an actual bilingual teacher in the classroom with more than 10 years of experiences. And my students, my future bilingual teachers, were exposed to this text. So they were using translanguaging text articles in Spanish, articles in English, and they were able to use the language that they wanted in order to discuss or write. Here, this is Paola, and this is in Spanish. I don't think that we have time to translate it. After using this translanguage in practice, having students become the language policy makers in the classroom, she was able to write a coherent text, even though she was not recommended to get into the program because she didn't have the Spanish proficiency needed to be part of a bilingual cohort. But by using this to be able to have the choice to use the language that she felt more comfortable, she was able to produce this language, this text. So some of the results in my own study, that participants were able to be policy language makers in the classroom. And they were able to name what they were doing in the classroom, and they name it academic code switching. Again, that's just only a contextual name. The students were very proud of using translanguaging, or however they want to call it, in this case, academic code switching. And they felt that it was another skill that they felt very proud of, instead of being ashamed for these languages. And also it was part of cultural affirmation. Now, allowing the students to use their linguistic practice was not just only for identity affirmation or cultural affirmation, because being able to use them in a free way was a motivation for them to wanting to learn more Spanish. And in that sense, they were able to pass the BTLPT exam. Now, the BTLPT exam is a Spanish exam for teachers who want to become bilingual teachers. And it's a context-based exam, very rigorous. And all of them were able to pass, and right now they are teaching. This exam, only 35% of the people who take this exam pass the first time. And all of them were able to pass, and they are right now bilingual teachers. I want to just end this with this bilingual love poem, because translanguaging or pocho, academic language, is my language. I just not speak Spanish or English. I speak this language. Your sonrisa is a sunshine that was reaped from your smile, soothed like a semilla into the soul of my soul with ardent passion, passion ardiente, sizzling in a mar de amar, where more is amor, in the sea of sea, filled with the salt, the sal of the salt, in the saliva of the saliva, that gives sad but is never sad. Two tongues that come together is not a French kiss, but bilingual love. Thank you. So do you have any questions? Or you want to comment on something? Yeah, go ahead.
So the way that I read about translanguaging, it seems to come from this place of making sure that particularly students who speak languages other than English in the home, so minority language speakers in the United States, are legitimized, if you will.
Yes.
Right? And their language practices are legitimized. What I struggle with is having that then be applied to language immersion programs for majority language kids, or majority language kids even in a two-way immersion program, where we struggle to keep them speaking the target language because they use English so much. You know what I mean?
That's true.
So I just kind of wonder where you come from when it comes to, you know, talking with teachers who are working with majority language kids in the U.S. in addition to minority language learners, and where you, I don't know, how do you talk
That's
about
a very interesting question, because with these students, these bilingual students, it was difficult to make that shift. They were used to speaking English only. I mean, all of them were, their first language easily was, most of them, English was their first language. And if they spoke Spanish at home, they were very ashamed to bring those languages in the classroom. So it was a struggle. But it was the modeling. I was able to use Spanish myself all the time, using other texts which they have to use in order to engage in conversation. That was important. But I'm talking. This is very contextual. I'm talking about higher ed, so I'm not talking about children. But the fact that they were able to progress in Spanish, and even though I'm not saying I'm using. I agree with the fact that you can use translanguage in order to promote language development. In this case, Spanish. In this case, that was not. That was a byproduct of what happened in the classroom. They were able to develop Spanish in tangible ways, and they were able to pass the professional exam in Spanish. So again, the use of translanguage in the classroom promoted that. Their eagerness to learn more of that language, to be able to mix them. They started using very high academic vocabulary, or using translinguismo, for example, or adquisición de lengua, and they were not afraid to include it in the repertoire by using Spanish and English. So they were learning and using vocabulary in Spanish by introducing little by little in their English, in their discourse in Spanish.
They were all Latino, right? I mean,
Yes, they were all Latino.
families where Spanish was spoken to some level.
And there were English speakers too. And there were Latino students who never spoke English, never spoke Spanish at home. Actually, I have one of my students said that she resented her dad, who was a Mexican, would never speak Spanish to them. So there was a mix of students. It was not just only people who were speaking Spanish at home and they were very afraid. There were English-speaking students who were able to benefit from translanguaging practice and language ecology in the classroom. And that motivated them to learn more Spanish. Yes.
I'm just thinking, to extend Dee's question a little bit, it's a very complicated issue
Oh, yes.
here with the Ojibwe and Dakota immersion, where many times kids come to immersion classrooms, excuse me, monolingual or in English, and then this is their one protected space to learn Ojibwe or learn
Oh, yes.
immersion. And so the questions of
Oh, yeah.
translanguaging and what's appropriate there are
Yeah,
really complicated.
yeah, and exactly because it's a language preservation, and revitalization. Yes, and that's a difficult question to answer, because we can see that Spanish is maintained in the United States because of the big influx of people coming from Latin America. So that's why it doesn't die. It revitalizes by itself. But what about with Ojibwe or other native languages? And that's a good question. How can translanguaging be used in spaces like that? There is a big conflict. And it's no more about culture, how to preserve culture if we want to hybridize that space. And at the same time, these students are already using English, so it's impossible to ignore that they are gonna mix it. So there is a big conflict there. It's very complex. I agree. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So you kind of laid up nicely what the translanguaging kind of gets us.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you wanted to think about like what we might lose by adopting that. I'm kind of circling back to, code switching work being really important in undoing notions of semi-lingual.
Oh, yes.
Are we at risk?
What are we losing? I think that one of the things that we are losing with that, especially with a group like this, because they are bilingual teachers. And the reality is that they will have to teach Spanish and English in the classroom. And actually, part of my research was my students saying, yes, I can use translanguaging, but I had to teach language separately, because they didn't want to repeat the cycle that happened to them when they were kids. So they knew that they had to learn more English and teach more English, and learn Spanish and teach Spanish. So they were dealing with juggling two ideologies. Like, yes, I can practice this, but at the same time, but my job is this. So yes, there are some problems of what is necessary for them and what is necessary for their students in the future in order for them to even finish high school.
You mentioned the teacher's experience influencing their use of languages. What was their experience? I mean, what
when I show some of the translanguaging text from actual teachers.
Right, or when you mentioned that their own experience, they didn't want to repeat their own experience when they taught.
Especially for the students who couldn't learn Spanish, or the Spanish development, they felt that it was very limited and they were ashamed. Yeah. Yes. They felt that. What was your question again?
So how is that influencing then their perspective on what they would do in the classroom in terms of how they would use future languages?
First, that they were not afraid to use their language practices. They felt that they were valid in the classroom, and they were very similar to the students that they are actually teaching right now, and they can use it as a resource. And the students were going to be able to use them in order to respond in the classroom, to produce work. At the same time, they were going to, in order for it to be clear, they will have students, their future students, or right now, they are teaching right now, participants in the language policies in the classroom, the same way that happened in my classroom with them. So they were at least the way that they talk about the language used in the research site. They were saying that they would like to replicate the same because they felt that was very beneficial for them. So because they experienced that, they were thinking of taking that into their own practice. Yeah. Yes.
So the translanguaging work that I'm familiar with, most of it focuses on language teachers, English teachers, and languages. But what I've seen happen with language teachers is that it gets used in a way that actually reifies or supports these kind of deficit narratives of languages other than English, and it gets used as a scaffold to access English. And we see it taking place because the structures that happens there, these ESL programs that are transitional into English dominant.
Mm-hmm. And they are using the framework of translanguaging in order to do so.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the idea is like it'll get them to English only.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I put the title of this talk. When you say that you're using translanguaging practices or translanguaging pedagogies in the classroom, what are you really talking about? So in order for teachers to understand what they are actually doing in the classroom, and you say reifying colonial ways to see languages, they need to understand what translanguaging is and what they are getting into, which is a completely different paradigm from just only code switching.
So my question is, what if you were to imagine with us a little, what would schools need to look like for translanguaging to actually be in schools?
And that's a very interesting classroom. What happened in my research site, I was an instructor in a bilingual education site, and I talked to the people in charge, instructors and the professors, that I was going to use these practices. I was going to allow to use Spanish and English the way that they wanted to do. The program coordinator and the professors in that department agreed with that. They supported that idea. So there should be an understanding from the school administrators, the people in charge of the classroom, of what they are getting into. They need to understand that, and they need to trust the process too. And also, I guess also there needs to be a model on how that works. And again, that part of my dissertation is gonna be published soon, of how students use translanguaging practices in order to improve L2, if we can call it L2, because that's not even part of translanguaging approach. So it is very difficult. Ofelia Garcia put this new approach, and all these scholars put this approach, but how do we see language? And again, there should be a merging of different paradigms to see language development, and at the same time, liberatory linguistic practices as we saw here.
I wanted to expand on Jenna's question of here in the Twin Cities in particular, in our ESL classrooms, our students might have multiple first languages. The teacher might not speak any of those languages. And so I appreciate your response that the administration needs to have a sense of what's going on. But could you give any examples of what that might look like in one classroom where there might be 5 or 6 languages represented and a teacher who's monolingual English? How might she or he support translanguaging in that space?
Yeah. I remember Angela Chris and Blackenridge talk about a similar scenario where there were 3 languages in the same classroom, and the teachers, according to that research, allow students to use them. And recommended that the teachers were able to become learners, language learners, not just the only language model in the classroom, or to be able to accept that they don't have this linguistic control because they are going to use the language that they feel they need to use. So again, vulnerability from the teacher to accept that they are going to learn another language, or the students are going to use the language that they want. That would be a first step. How does it look like in your context? That's what research is for. Just to see it. Yes.
Just follow up on that a little. So Kenda and Martha and I did a study where in a small technical school where we had this issue because we had home language Spanish speakers or almost speakers and Somali speakers in the same classroom. And one of the interesting things that happened was, although we set up these isolated opportunities for the learners to communicate with each other in their own home language group, they ended up building connections abroad.
Yes.
And so we had, especially amongst the Oromo and Somali speakers, where the Oromo speakers just kind of got folded in to the Somali group. And so there was, so that was just one observation. So I don't speak Oromo or Somali. I can understand and read that Spanish and understand, but I'm not proficient enough to pass the Spanish.
It was a good reminder that even when you can set up these home language spaces, that we were really committed to having places for students to develop their native language literacy skills. We had Somali speakers writing in Spanish sometimes. Lots of times people would write in English. Like it kind of like our colonial our colonial ideal of promoting
what language?
Mother tongue.
Yes.
This I think falls short, and I think we realized in our study, although we didn't focus on it a ton, was I have a bias about translanguaging that it has something to do with language maintenance and maintenance of home language, especially in communities where the dominant language is different from that. And so if you are a native English speaker who's teaching ESL in that context, how do you know that you're supporting literacy in Somali for your Somali students while you're also building English language literacy? That's the big challenge, I think.
It is. Yeah, one of the many. Yeah.
I'm thinking part of the work that you're doing with students, and I'm thinking about what went on and still goes on in upstate New York, where the students create, and their creations are shared too, and their creations might be in Somali, it might be translation, etc. But it's all about people, students, taking power through the languages that they have access to intentionally. Thinking about the identity work, how do I see am I represented out there? I represent myself. And so there you do have an artifact that you have to do program evaluation and say, am I supporting as well as English skills in ESL classroom? Am I also supporting the skills in Somali, Spanish, or more, etc.? You have an artifact. I mean, you want to look at things like program evaluation, which are clear that it's
You said that at the end, these are in the teaching training program, right? And
they were,
And then, so they did well on the Spanish test. Do they also have to take a test of their English ability
No.
at the end? Okay.
No,
So
they
that's
didn't. No.
Assumed and
Yes, and that's a good question because the following cohort I taught there was mostly Spanish speaking. No, she was a Spanish speaking student who wanted to improve her English. That was the other side. So she was very scared of not being able to develop English skills. Yes, that was that case. But it was not part of my research, but it kept me thinking. How useful is it, or how difficult it is for somebody who speaks a different language survive in an English-only environment. Yes.
So I have a question about the first language. So the two questions. So first is if we think about the trans languages, the same as the all the language will be all the languages and as a whole. So we know that the code switch is kind of like a language. They are totally different. Language and language are different, right? So they are in a distinct like space. But for the translanguaging, we think that it's a whole language system. So from this part, how we can define from the phenomenal piece. So when the students was talking, like mix the language together, how we can define that is a code switch and versus the translanguage. So this is the first.
That's a very interesting question, and that stems from the fact that we see, and I've seen lots of people saying that code switching is one part of translanguaging, but it's a different way to see languages. When you talk about translanguaging, you don't analyze it from a linguistic point of view. This part, for example. This part is in Spanish, and this part is in English, and this part is in Spanish again. When you talk about translanguage, you see just only a unitary linguistic practice. So there is no distinction between Spanish and English, which makes it very difficult to analyze it from a linguistic standpoint. I agree with that.
Okay, so another question is like if we consider about like complexity multiple like a translanguaging model, just I Kindle just sent a random paper I read about that. So it is kind of like a consider like the translanguaging means like some parts they are similar. Some language parts are similar, some language parts are different. And it is let me connect with the Kuhn's like underlying proficiency, like kind of like hypothesis, and how we can use the translanguaging into the bilingualism development.
And that's a very interesting question. That's another controversy of how do we see translanguaging from a psycholinguistic point of view. According to the literature on translanguaging, there is just only one unitary grammar system. But again, how can bilingual or multilingual people can distinguish can follow certain grammatical rules in each language? For example, púchame. How that person was able to use the Spanish rules and introduce English too. So in the art, and I recommend you to read the latest Max Swann article. He goes for the multilingual perspective, in which, yes, there is a unitary grammar system, but at the same time is divided in different branches. And that's what he proposes in order to make sense of what translanguaging, the multilingual brain works. Where's my water? Yeah, it is, and that's one of the gaps in the translanguaging practice. How does it work, like at a psychological level?
Another question. So, Jenna made a great point about the use of translanguaging as a means to English, like as a scaffold to English language literacy development. Understanding the systems that we work and teach in and train teachers to participate in, isn't that okay? I mean, isn't it better to think about language as a unified pool of linguistic resources that we can encourage our learners to support, like to draw from?
I agree.
Even if it's just a goal of English language literacy development. I mean, so I guess I'm conflicted in, if we only think about translanguaging as a response to colonial thinking about language and schooling, and
that's a really hard thing for a lot of people, and like especially in the adult basic education world where I come from, where we can't even like officially use home languages in classrooms in this state. So if and it is a state policy, you can find it on their website. If I go into teacher conferences and I start talking about translanguaging, and I don't include some sort of language around how it is important to bring in home languages so that we can work toward English language literacy, if I don't include that part, it goes nowhere.
And that's true, and that was something intangible for the participants of my research. If they didn't develop Spanish skills to be able to speak and write, and not just only any kind of speaking or writing, the test that they had to take was professionally contextualized. What the questions that you need to answer in the exam, be it orally or in written form, were based on the school. So they had to speak educación, as I call it. They needed to speak educación in order to pass that exam, and that was something tangible. If they didn't pass, they were not going to be able to be bilingual teachers at all. So it's a reality. But again, they were using this translanguaging practices, and they were able to pass the exam. And at the same time, they thought that they were going to use it, not only because it helped them develop their Spanish skills, the translanguaging motivated them to develop their Spanish skills, and at the same time, they were proud to use it at any time. The students were incredibly creative during the classroom, and they were creating their own language, classroom language, using all the linguistic practice. So if yes, it affirms your identity and your cultural identification, but at the same time, you can see the byproduct, as you said, that they were able to perform. And the same participants are going to tell you that yes, they are going to use it, and yes, they are going to teach Spanish only, and yes, they are going to teach English. So again, if we're thinking about translanguaging in a liberating ways, from the standpoint starting from the individual, they are going to tell you they are going to use all of them because they need it. So yes, you can do that for pedagogical practices, yes. And there's a lot of literature on that, on how to do it, and how it looks like in the classroom too. Okay, I don't know how long do we have? Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for coming. Won't have some sun, it's so beautiful outside.